3, 2, 1. I think the specific problem with the status quo is that army recruitment is done in a targeted, coercive manner against those from the most low socioeconomic backgrounds who are the most vulnerable, and results in the worst type of people being recruited to the army in a manner which perpetuates a specifically toxic culture that results in people being unable to readjust. We think our mechanism fixes that at the point we have a lottery regarding any like fit, young, able people who are able to like go do it once, receive an army wage, and receive the after support. We think we're going to hard prop this in order to get any delta, no conscientious objection, and there's going to be 2 additional things in my speech. First of all, characterizing the status quo with regards to the specific harms of the recruitment. Second of all, with regards to how this improves army culture, macro impacts of that. What does status quo recruitment look like? I think this specifically looks like providing really propagandistic ads of people who are like failing in school and now see the army as their only way out. I think this looks like people going to like shopping malls in low socioeconomic income areas to try and specifically prey on those people who have been shut out of other state systems in order to try and get like more meat shields for the army, right? I think you hold specific things like money, like a higher education, other things that are required to live your life, I'll take the clarification in a second, to any meaningful extent over these people's head as some sort of carrot in a manner by which at the point that they are unable to like self-actualize themselves to conceive of any other manner in which they are able to access these things because of specific state failures, the army fill that gap and provide this. I'll take the clarification now.
Every conscription policy on the planet currently has a buyout policy for the richest people in society. I really hope you're defending that as well.
Like a buyout policy for the richest people in society. I don't know what you mean by that. Like, I'm saying that we are literally providing this to everybody. We are trying to accrue much of a delta as possible. We want this to specifically be all of those who are able in order to try and accrue as much impact from this debate. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. I think what they do then, crucially, at the point that these people are young and they engage in this socio-economic deprivation, no thank you, I think this is the point where these people are like unable to make a specific, informed, consenting decision. Why is this? Because at the point that you are young and you have not encountered as many experiences, it necessarily means that you are unable to make a decision for something that is so long-term and is going to have such irreparable effects. Note in most countries you are able to join the army before you are able to purchase alcohol. I think at the point that you are able to join this when you are first of all so young, and second of all when the incentives for your joining have been offered are so intense and that are like so life-changing and are so unable to access in any other ways, we think this is specifically when it is intensely coercive. This means that there is coercion on either side of the house. The specific differential then is that at the point that we at least now make it egalitarian, there is some redress, and it is no longer the entireties of one community being decimated, but rather it is instead spread out across through an egalitarian mechanism throughout the entirety of society. We think these are 2 important contributions that this makes. We think also it is specifically pernicious for it to be done perniciously in this way, because at the point that these people are like being coaxed into engaging this by the state because the state has failed to provide them the things that they need for real life, we think at the point we think this is like morally abhorrent, right? That the state is able to deprive them of things like higher education, offer it as a consequence of the time in the army, and to like allow this like conveyor belt to keep going. Because here's the crucial thing, right? The specific existence of the army and being able to opt into it in this way means that the burden is specifically taken off the government to provide these services. And I think there is like 2 crucial things that change here. Because first of all, note that like there is probably just a governmental incentive to provide higher education usually is probably beneficial for your economy and your workforce. At the point that, however, you are able to provide this by people opting in, first of all, is a path of least resistance. At the point that people are doing this, you don't really have the incentive to offer them other services and other mechanisms to access this. Secondly, it intuitively acts as like 2 birds, 1 stone. The other reciprocal of this is now there is more demand at the point where people no longer opt into these and instead are more likely to pressure the government to provide the services that we need. We think we've proven why recruitment is particularly bad on our side and why we make it comparatively egalitarian. How then does this change the army in a better way? 4 strands to this. First of all, in terms of volume, there are a lot of conflicts that simply don't have the volume of people that they require. This is fairly intuitive. Secondly, in terms of skills, note that there are specific training gaps at the point that the people who are joining the army are generally going to be composed of those who have the least amount of skills, who have the least ability to like function in ways other than joining the low barrier of entry. Army, at the point we get different people, we get different skills. Crucially, however, in addition to the skills, there's different types of people. Who joins in the status quo? Two characterizations. First of all, those who have like a heavy national identity incentive. I think at the point it is no longer just these people joining, but it's no longer just like the gun-toting patriots, but rather it is a like more reflective of the population composition of people who have varied voices. I think there is a better culture within the army at the point that people are like able to somewhat reduce the toxic culture throughout it by no longer engaging in these practices, by having different sorts of dialogues, by rising up the ranks and being able to influence decisions to some comparative extent. We think there are a lot of bad impacts in this. First of all, if a point is composed of people like this, it probably like affects your views of others like negatively. Second of all, at the point that you like view this up the ranks, you probably engage in more pernicious types of warfare. We probably get a specific important counter voice on this. Second of all, you probably get the school bully type joining it, who are probably engaging in practices like toxic masculinity and perpetuate this narrative through the army, who join it because they want to be strong. The problem with this is it specifically makes readjustment to civilian life afterwards really tricky at the point that you perpetuate this culture that is unable to be replicated like back in civilian life. I think at the point that we provide counter voices to this culture that are likely to be listened to for three mechanisms. First of all, camaraderie. Second of all, the effectiveness of the unit. And third of all, just the pure number of these people. We think this is when you change the culture. Crucially, this has a macro effect to the point that generally people in the army often afterwards end up ascending to things like governmental positions. We think at the point that you change the culture within the army to this extent, this has a trickle-up effect whereby it affects the larger things. But there's a fourth strand to this, because note here, there is no incentive to care about soldiers right now, because the people who join the army generally have no political capital. At the point that it's now like we rich Oxbridge debaters who are getting drafted into the army, they specifically probably have parents who are now going to pressure the army to try and provide more support and use their capital to try and lobby the army to be better. We care about this for three reasons. First of all, the army has such high consequences in addition to the after leaving it. Second of all, these are people who are perennially shut out. Third of all, it is the state responsibility to look after people who act at the arms of the state. Look, we think army culture is pretty fucking bad. The manner in which it perpetuates its recruitment cultures is coercive, it's toxic, and at least on our side, we get a better culture with more egalitarian voices within it to result in all of these impacts. Opening government.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. Now I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the first speaker of the opposition side.
Hey, can you hear me? Awesome, cool. In opening opposition, we're not shying away from our burden. We know this recruitment that we're defending is aggressive. We're defending things like campaigns, like mass information campaigns to get people to join the army. We even think it's aggressive enough that we're going to give benefits to people who join the army, things like housing, material benefits. We're happy to stand behind that. I think this is very fair, and that we're not shying away. But the thing is that I don't think it's fair for opening government to just fiat that aggressive recruitment necessitates exploitative and unequal recruitment, because we support aggressive recruitment at every stage of society. I think this is realistically the trajectory the states are heading in for a couple of reasons. First of all, there have been legal challenges raised about states being exploitative for all the reasons Joseph said. That doesn't mean they have to be less aggressive in how they recruit or the extent to which they recruit. It just means they have to not exploit particular groups. But secondly, because I think like this issue that Jason's talking about is getting more attention. Like now we're starting to realize that armies are doing predatory recruitment practices through spread of the information through the internet, which is starting to call states out to exploitative practices. So I just want to be clear that it's not fair for government to fiat aggressive as exploitative and unequal. I'm actually going to engage with OG's best case or worst case, their best case, and say, well, even if it does affect vulnerable groups, we still win on opposition. But I do think it's important to point out that that's not something they can just fiat in the motion. Two main points. First of all, how this is better for the people who join the army, like regardless on either side, and I'll do the comparative. And then secondly, how it affects the military. My rebuttal will be integrated. So let's talk about the people who join, because assuming OG are correct and you're coerced into joining the army, or incentivized, coerced to join the army because you are, you have a lack of other opportunities, because you're stuck in a cycle of poverty, the education system fails you. The moral problem here is very, very clearly the fact that you don't have better options, right? So the army is still your best option because you had to opt into it. OG tried to get around this by saying that incentives to provide education and benefits, etc., are crowded out because you can just join the army, which I genuinely think is nonsense. Like, youth homelessness is a massive problem. Child poverty is a massive problem. It's not because the government are like, oh, they could just join the army, so we don't have to give them problems. It's a visibility problem, right? Where there's no attention to those issues regardless. So I think the problem, which we can fix on both sides, and the real moral problem, is that people are forced to join the army because they don't have other options. So we should provide them other options. But the fact they do join the army, so because the counterfactual is probably being caught up in poverty, being caught up in crime, being caught up in massive social exclusion. But I think realistically, we also engage with the characterization that armies give people at least something which they can't have otherwise, which is like employment, ability to learn skills, and kind of integrate to some extent. Most armies don't actually go to war, by the way. I think a lot of the time when people join the army, they're just training, but don't actually get caught up in the kind of horrific things we're talking about. So I think the comparative is probably worse for these people, or they wouldn't opt into it just through incentives, because an incentive isn't a coercion. It's only coercion if you think that by virtue of you not having other options, you're coerced. It's just that happens to be the best option because all your options are shit. So I think that takes kind of the moral claim out of opening government. But secondly, even if you are incentivized strongly into it, which I think is fair, I think there's an inherent value in feeling like you're in control of the situation, that you opted into that consent in the first place, even if it's not. Why? Because ownership of your actions means that when you go through these experiences, you're going to do it through the lens of agency and opportunity and empowerment, because you see the capacity to self-develop and serve your country and do something important, which gives you a massive, massive feeling of value, which is what's going to motivate you through the most dehumanizing, horrible experiences of war, if you do get sent to war. Obviously, because that is what denies your personhood, that is what strips you of humanity when you're put in these terrible, terrible circumstances. I think the comparative when you've been conscripted is that you feel exploited, that you feel like this institution is out to get you and you're just there because you're a puppet in a big machine rather than because you have some intrinsic moral value. Given that presumably a symmetric amount of people are going to go to war on either side, I think the fact that the experience of them makes them worse at their job, but puts massive psychological burden on them, is a massive harm which applies to anyone regardless of how they're recruited into it, which makes a difference. In terms of ownership of that. The third reason I think we get better for the people that go to war is that there's a unique glorification which society gives you by the virtue of serving your nation, right? This is something which the most disadvantaged people at least have when they opt into the army, because people listen to soldiers' takes on political issues where otherwise they wouldn't, because we see them as having a value, because they risk their life for us, and it's something valuable. There's a reason why there is more focus on veteran homeless, although not enough, more focus on veteran homelessness than there is general homelessness, because we ascribe a value and a reciprocal obligation to people who've served in war. I think this is because the most vulnerable people in society suffer from a visibility problem where their struggles aren't unified. So the comparative is when you're conscripted, there's no moral worth attached to your action because you were forced to go. Like, why would we commend someone who was forced to do anything? That's just not that impressive, because anyone could have done it. There was no like dignity, no bravery, nothing that you specifically showed or you gave to your nation. So you take away the need to compensate people for sacrifice, which I think decreases capacity to be able to help people after war to reintegrate in society, which is something that we have better capacity to do on our side when we listen to them. But let's move on to the second big clash, which is about the military. First of all, to engage explicitly with OGs next, they say more people. I just think that's not a, I mean, kind of symmetric, right? But also not important now. Like, wars are fought with technology. I don't think we need massive manpower. Then they say they get skills. I think, like, you give them skills. I think the kind of skills you learn in the army, if you're on the ground, are quite specific. I think the people who do the fancy tech stuff in the military, like, there's not a representation problem there. So I don't think we have a massive dearth of skills, which you have to fix on our side at all. The next thing they say is quite bizarre, because it's like the culture of the army improves. And I just want to push back on the intuition. Like, you're forced to do this, right? You're subjected to horrible conditions. You lose part of your life that you wanted to have other, like, career plans or education plans or, like, anything in your personal life. Like, you feel like that time has been robbed from you. This plays massive resentment towards being in the army and therefore the institution as a whole, which I think gives you less incentive to integrate effectively. I think this is particularly important, given the most important thing is how the army functions, right? Because when people make mistakes in conflict, it prolongs conflict, it puts people's lives at risk, which is a direct concrete harm. I think you make buy-in from soldiers significantly worse on our side, because they're resentful to the institution that they forced to be there, because they never consented, they have better things they want to do, they don't have any active incentives to do well because there's nothing they're seeking to gain out of the military, whereas the comparative is that when you choose to join, you want to gain some skills or you want to gain something because that's your incentive to join in the first place. You don't have trust of an institution because they deny you your agency and dehumanize you in this way. I think that means that you're less likely to be comfortable with what you're doing, you're less likely to develop the skills which opening government want you to have and be effective soldiers. This is the most important thing, right? Because on either side, war is going to happen better when you have soldiers who can trust each other, who can operate with a feeling of mutual understanding that they all consented to be there and they want to be there and do what's best for their country. I think this is something you have to weigh this debate massively importantly, because literally differences in communication, differences in like not trusting command structures or making bad judgments because you don't want to be there, so you're not as bought into your training, is the difference between life and death for the civilians on the ground, but also for the soldiers themselves, because you're more likely to die if you're thrust into a situation that you never consented to be in, where your life is put in danger during war and you don't have the skills because you don't want to be there. So even if there's like whoever gets put into the army is screwed on either side, the fact that you're able to at least do the job better and therefore give some degree of protection is a massive win for opposition. But I think the next thing to engage with is how we actually go to war in the first place, right? Because opening government said, like, you go to more wars. I think there are so many mechanisms that exist right now against going to bad wars, right? Because you have, like, you know, like massive public backlash, international outcry. I think actually having the capacity to know that you can go to war is massively important in a world where we're faced by incredibly unstable, aggressive, expansionist regimes. Even if we don't go to war, having a public which is always against war makes vulnerable people defenseless because there's no one to stand up against them. Lastly, I want to go against this intuition that we get more scrutiny on opening government side. Very few people are going to be conscripted. This is going to be a silent issue. On our side, when you have big recruitment campaigns, the army has to put out active messaging. It becomes ingrained in public consciousness. There's discussions and discourse about a role of the army because it's the forefront of people's decisions. They can't just be complacent that they're not going to be in the 0.02% of the population who get conscripted, so never pay attention to it. I'm proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and I would like to cross the floor and hear from the second speaker of the government bench, please.
Can people hear me? Okay. I'm going to start straight away with just a bit of rebuilding, and then most of my rebuttal will be just integrated, and I'll flag it when it comes up. Okay, I'm going to start off with this huge clash on consent. So I think that the opposition kind of missed the boat here on what Jason was trying to point out. We were largely trying to point out that consent is pretty much entirely symmetric on both sides. On one side, we have people who are essentially just being forced to join the army. They have no choice. They're being conscripted. And on the other side, we have all of our analysis about people who join the army are largely low income. They're largely doing this out of coercive incentives. The things that change here are twofold. Firstly, it's the actual composition of who is joining the army and who is like being subjected to all of these violent conflicts. And the second thing that changes is a few perverse incentives of the government and some misallocation of resources. Okay, why consent is largely symmetric? I'm going to just do a bit of rebuilding very quickly. Again, we're talking about low-income people being coerced through things like predatory scholarship programs. So these people are being offered either the means to succeed and thrive in the modern economy, like third-level education, access more wealth, future generational benefits, etc., versus the opposite, which is like not having access to any of these things. Often there's kind of only one correct answer to this decision. The thing that OO tells you, which is actually correct, is that they're choosing between two like bad decisions, and one of them is just slightly better. This is just incredibly coercive. But the problem we have with this is it creates like perverse government incentives. Okay, so OO rebut what we've already said by saying like this is false, and like the counterfactual is that these people just don't access any government services whatsoever. They don't get any third level education. I think firstly I'd like to please note that they misunderstand the power of the military industrial complex in the first place. I don't think that this power should be understated or dismissed, but even if the incentive is small, I think the fact that it still exists is like a comparative harm on our side. I don't think they can mitigate this out of the debate. If you have like even if you make a small financial barrier to entry for third level education, you're still going to shut out like some people, right? You can create like a small financial barrier and then have all of those people join the military, or you can like have a larger one. I don't think it really matters. I think what matters is that there's still a comparative harm of perverse incentives on our side. Okay, what else did we talk about? So Jason talked about other people that are likely to join the military. We're talking about highly patriotic, often children of military families. It looks like children who have been raised surrounded by like nationalist propaganda their whole lives, people weaponizing tragedies like 9/11 to drive recruitment. Maybe they've got family members who pressure them to enlist. They're being targeted also by huge ad campaigns that are associating enlistment with like things like masculinity, glory, and national identity. So for example, Call of Duty and other like FPS games, and also some big movies like Marvel movies that like kind of glorify military life are hugely subsidized like by military budgets all the time. So we also have here a huge misallocation of resources that's going to these ad campaigns to like promote all of these promote the military lifestyle, promote enlistment, that are like I'm pretty sure Gov has fiat to say, okay, we'll use these resources to make like third level education more accessible. Okay, we're also talking about just very young impressionable people. They're highly subject to suggestion. They don't really understand the repercussions of their decisions. So we have a complete lack of informed consent. We have no consent on our side. There's no consent on either side. This clash is a wash. Okay, now the only comparative harm we have left is a huge waste of government resources wasted on advertisements and propaganda. I think if we care about like poor people at all or government services, this has to fall on our side. The ultimate conclusion is we prey on people least able to understand the weight of this decision. We waste resources, we create perverse incentives, and we disproportionately recruit the poor. Okay, I'm going to move on to a bit more impacting, but first I will take a POI from opening.
Is there a difference between living in a high crime area because you're poor and the government forcing you to live in a high crime area?
Forcing you to, is there a difference between the government forcing you to live? I think if you're poor and you can't afford to move to a better area and the government is somewhat responsible because they've neglected your area to the extent that like it's full of crime, I think the government's responsible for you like living in that area. I don't think there's a huge difference. I think either way the government has a responsibility to your safety. I think that it's like the same. Okay, why is it bad when only poor people are recruited? So the first thing that's just obvious, an obvious comparative harm on our side, is that we should probably care if poor people are being forced into the most dangerous jobs and are being killed the most and killed disproportionately. But also, we should probably also be worried about destroying poor communities by poaching young workers that are like most necessary for local economies to function and forcing them into jobs that are like completely away from their region. We're kind of like just artificially doing a brain drain here. It's just an unnecessary harm that could be avoided by like equally taking people from every area. Okay, the second thing is something Jason already touched on. Nobody really like seems to care about poor people generally in society. The mechanism for this is that like most people that are related to the most influential classes in society will never currently enlist willingly because they can afford college education, because they have access to like adequate resources. They don't like need to join the military just to access healthcare. Okay, but when like when I'm like a Tory and like my son is being recruited into the army, things that I'll probably insist on are things like better conditions for soldiers in the first place, and also mandatory like aftercare for soldiers. I think a lot of like problems that are inherent in the military, things like post-traumatic stress, are largely ignored, and the reason being is because the demographics are a section of society that basically nobody cares about. I think when we make recruitment more egalitarian, when everyone is recruited like equally, we have incentives to actually care about soldiers. We have incentives to like make sure that they're adequately provided for both during and post conflict. Okay, then lastly on army culture. So the rebuttal that we're told to like, oh, army culture won't improve, is that we're told that like being forced to join the army means like less soldiers will buy into the system. I think this is just wrong intuitively, unless like every country that has mandatory military service like Switzerland has this attitude. I'm pretty sure their militaries are functional. I'm pretty sure they're doing fine. I also think we're often forced to do things by the state. For example, like we're forced to go to education to like second level. This doesn't mean that every single school has like a shit culture because everyone's like, oh, I hate like the fact that I can't just not have an education. I don't want to have to learn to read and write. I think all of Jason's analysis then on culture improving still stands. We get a reduction in like toxic attitudes. We get diversity of voices. We don't just have the same few people with the same nationalist political beliefs. I think overall there's many comparative benefits on our side. You have to stand with OG.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. Now I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the second speaker of the opposition side, please.
Can you hear me? I almost got stabbed in the high school I grew up in, but I'm pretty sure that DPM isn't referring to that high school, because I do think there's a principal distinction between being compelled to go to fucking school and fighting on a battlefield. The distinction that they missed in DPM, and this is an attempt, in my opinion, blatantly to burn my closing, is to say that there is an independent difference between compelling someone to do something and them being forced out of circumstance. The difference is an active responsibility on your part. It is the difference between me not caring for their child and them growing up to not be successful versus me actively abusing my child so they don't grow up to be successful. For better or for worse, the government is complicit in both cases. I just think it's overwhelmingly more complicit in the other case, insofar as the crime of negligence is significantly less worse than the crime of actively forcing you to put your body on the line. Note, this is different from taxation. This is different from going to high school for some reason, because it's literally risking your life. It's risking your personhood by the very act of you going to the military. I think this principle of consent stands independently of anything I'll say in this debate. 4 points of framing. Most countries don't fucking go to war. If their argument is about more wars, less wars, etc., you're talking about the US and Russia and not about the 220 other countries. Number two, there are many regulations that exist on these people to not have bad wars. Like every single international regulation ever, your Supreme Court, your constitution, your democracy, your public pushback, your media, etc. Like there are too many to list here. Number three, you will still advertise to go to war. You know why? Because you still have to fucking vote on war. The army doesn't decide for you to go to war. In fact, I would posit that most funding is spent by the Republican Party interrogating the case for Iraq or interrogating the case for Afghanistan, as opposed to being like, oh, by the way, you should also join in. So if you want to claim the benefit that money goes elsewhere on, you can claim that world schools benefit. I just think that's very, very marginal. The fourth point of framing I want to make here is the other people world schools benefit. These people could have been put to other causes. One, this is in direct tension with your first argument, saying that these are the most destitute and homeless people in our society. So I don't know if they're going to become software engineers next week. But two, we say that for the sort of people that you want in the army in specialist positions, those positions are very meritocratic to begin with. So realistically, in the Royal Navy, the sort of people who are software engineers are actual fucking Cambridge and Oxford software engineers. It's not some random schmuck that they pick up off of society. For better or for worse, the army helps the poor. All the other jobs are taken by the rich, and I think we're really, really fine with that. Two clashes in my speech. One, the individual, two, the army. Let's start with the army first, because they said they can't wash away the military-industrial complex. Yes, I fucking can, because that's an argument about the US and maybe one more country. So you can take that if you want, but I have three other mechanisms for why the military-industrial complex doesn't exist. One, the sour grapes argument. Every single time you give a criticism against the army now, it's going to be delegitimized because it's going to look like precisely what opening government said. They're only saying it because their son is in the army. They're only saying it because their daughter is in the army. That's a huge, huge problem on their side, because even if they get criticism, usually from leftist quarters, it's going to be completely delegitimized for oddly the same reason that they gave. Secondly, no response to this from DPM. When you advertise to be in the army, you are advertising the army. Literally, if there's an ad in the New York Times asking me to be part of the US Army, more people are going to talk about it now. It's in the public spotlight now. It's being scrutinized now. I just think that's really important to point out. And it's got no response from DPM. Insofar as conscripting people, which is letter in the post saying you're in the army for next 2 years, is significantly much worse than the point at which the army doesn't put itself out there and get more and more people in. The third thing that I say is, in terms of accountability, the sort of accountability that they get in their best case is rich people's priorities. Because according to their own mechanism, their only mechanism for change is that rich Oxford kids come in and then they decide how the army works. Yeah, rich kids, Oxford kids come in and they decide how the army works. It's extremely unclear to me that the sort of changes that they will make will be the sort of changes that everyone else wants. But even if there is an alignment of interest, I question this intuition. Literally every conscription policy on the planet allows you to buy yourself out of conscription, $500,000, 500,000 rand, whatever your currency fucking may be. This means that if anything, there's going to be mass complacency on their side, insofar as the most politically and financially influential actors will never be part of the army to begin with, and they will be coerced into being part of this army. I think that's really important. At the end of this clash, then the army is significantly more accountable on our side. And even if it isn't, I just think it's important to point out that the sort of reforms that they get tend to be concentrated towards the interests of the elite. The second part of the army clash is effectiveness. There was minimal response to this. And here what we said was, again, it's not just about having consent, it's about feeling like you have consent. A tightly knit unit is a unit which fucking wants to be there in the first place. If someone doesn't want to be there, realistically speaking, what you're looking at are court martials for people who refuse to serve in the army, conscientious objectors in droves, and more often, just disengagement from the army. Think about it this way: if the army does commit abuses, what incentive do you have to report on it if you don't feel like that's a smudge on your personal pride? You fucking hate the army as well. You have no incentive to do that. If anything, you're just delegitimizing the institution that you're forced to be a part of. Like, I think, if anything, the incentive is on our side, where you have a sense of ownership, like Ira said, a sense of personhood attached to this institution, where every single abuse committed by that army is a personal smudge on your own pride, and you want that army to be cleaned up as much as possible. What this means then is that we have significantly more buy-in and significantly more accountability insofar as the army is concerned. Before I talk about the individual stuff, I'd love to engage with closing extension for fairness. Anything? Yeah, go on, please. Yeah.
Do you think that?
Yeah, no, please.
Oh, do you think that it's okay for poor people to sell their organs?
Yeah, perfectly, especially if they have no other choice. So based on to the individual stuff, I have 3 things to say here. The first thing is about drinking the Kool-Aid. The second thing is about not drinking the Kool-Aid. So let's assume that you have drank the Kool-Aid and you buy the propaganda, all of that stuff. I think even in that world, the army serves as a social leveler. I think that's really important to understand. And this was the best phrase I've ever heard in any debate in this tournament. Predatory scholarships. What the fuck does that mean? There's scholarships which allow you to go to university when you otherwise would not have been able to go to university. I don't know how a scholarship is predatory insofar as the comparative was you literally sleeping on a park bench for the next 4 years. I think the GI Bill in the United States has been the most important social leveler in that society. Things like Levittown providing you housing, things like Title IX providing more women in the army education. All of these things are great on our side insofar as they become a social leveler. But the final thing that I say here is that even if you don't drink the Kool-Aid and you feel like you've been coerced into this option, I still think that you're better off insofar as the comparative is so much worse. They can't simply say the government is complicit unless they prove the government will change something. Like, like that argument is meaningless unless they're proving that there's a counterfactual which the government can do. If they haven't proved that, then they have one of 2 shit options. One of them is be homeless or be poor. On our side, the option is at least be part of something which A, gives you economic benefits, but B, gives you social legitimacy. You care about veterans, you don't care about the poor. You care about people fighting for your wars, you don't care about anyone else. I think we've proved to you that individuals in the army are significantly better off with a more accountable and effective army. Very, very proud to pose.
I would like to thank the speaker for that speech, and now I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the third speaker of the government bench, please.
Hello, am I audible? Cool. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think OG grasped both the correct points, but I think they missed the mechanisms to prove both of the things they're claiming, right? So I'll be giving you 2 analytical extensions today. Firstly, on the mechanisms of why recruitment is coercive and why, regardless of consent, the state should not allow it. And then secondly, on how we get, in the status quo, less reporting of bad conditions and war crimes, and how conscription fixes that, right? Before that, a quick strange point of rebuttal, because I couldn't fit in anywhere. On this point that both Kiara and Hamza keep bringing about how you can buy out your conscription virtually in every system. So your benefits apparently don't stand. Look, sure, maybe you can. I say make it like really expensive, right? We get 2 benefits out of this. Firstly, it's not like everyone with any kind of political capital, like middle class and above, will just buy out their conscription. That's not how it works in any country where we have it. I know I'm from Greece, right? I think maybe millionaires will do it, but that's probably fine. People who politicians care about still go. But also, secondly, I think like that additional money can be used to like buy better equipment and better like clothes and better conditions for soldiers who do go. And I think that's probably good. More money for the army on our side, right? Cool. 2 extensions. Moving on to the first one. Mechanisms of why recruitment is coercive. And I think this one misses from OG. So I think if you claim that, if you give them credit them with any benefits of proving that poor people have it tough in the army when it's a volunteer system, we should credit them to us as well, right? So I think there are 2 competing forces roughly that make poor people more likely to go to the army. The first is like literally the army ad center just gets more value for money when they advertise to poor people, right? Buying an ad, a local newspaper for a poor area will yield more people signing up than buying a similar ad in a local newspaper for a richer area. This means that it creates a positive feedback loop and you start going to that. It also means, right, that in order when you go to state schools, right, most teachers, most head teachers won't ask you to pay. You get to deliver your like recruitment pitch for free because for a lot of those kids, that is like the only viable option, right? And the teachers will welcome you there. Whereas private schools can just charge more and like make you pay for that, so you're less likely to go there, especially if fewer of them sign up. Like it's not like they're predatory on purpose. It's literally good value for money, and they have a limited budget to work with and a lot of army positions to fill. But look, even if OO wants to claim that they won't do this, it won't be allowed, which I really doubt. Just look at like any example of volunteer army anywhere in the world, right? I think even in their best case, right? I think the second competing force, the poor people literally have, in some cases, no competing forces, right? Because if you're richer, right, you have like your parents' money that you can rely on. You're like, you know what, I might be unemployed, but I'll stay on my parents' money for like 2 years and then be able to move on. Or you have teachers telling you, no, don't do that. Go to uni, do other things, right? I think this is the most crucial thing, right? Poor people that lack both of these forces will become a really, really appealing like demographic to target. I think there are several reasons, though, why this is not okay, which OG has to do. I know that this is not about consent, right? All I'm saying is this house prefers a world notion. We show you that in opposition's world, right, we have systemic problems with the army. We have poor people going to the army and essentially becoming fodder for rich people's wars. On our side, we don't. Even if they consent perfectly, I still think our world is a better one to live in. I still think we win the debate, right? But 3 reasons why it's bad. Firstly, what have we shown you, and what OO has done a really good job showing you, is like, look, everyone does the right thing by them, right? Poor people signing up to the army because they need the money and it's their best option. Teachers forcing them to go, like pushing them towards going because they know they'll succeed there. Army people accepting them and like targeting them. They're doing, because of their incentives, they're doing the best thing. But this leads to a bad outcome overall. This is exactly the kind of situation where the state should intervene to stop it from happening in the future, right? I think the second reason, however, is sort of addressing this claim that we get around, look, most people don't go to war. It's not even about war, right? It's basically a cushy office job and some training, right? I think the problem is that you can go to war, right? You literally sign away your rights, and the government has the right, no thank you, to send you to Afghanistan, send you to Iraq, and you could lose your life. People do lose their lives. And I think the poorer you are in the army, the fewer connections you have, the fewer officers you have, the fewer strings your parents can pull, meaning that you're likely to be sent to the front lines over like richer people who sign up just for the CV and to say they have served their country. So I think they do go to war and they do risk their lives. But now let's come back to the consent thing just a little bit, because I think there's like a key weighing here that sort of breaks the deadlock in top halfway. Because I think there's a big difference between saying this is their best option so they can consent to it and go to the army versus saying, like, it's basically wants to sound as if it's like, oh yeah, you get a bad job, right? Poor people get bad jobs all the time. It's fine. They make money, right? No, the problem is if I get a bad job, or a job I really, really hate, I can quit that job whenever I want, right? People have the right to quit their job. The problem is in the army, you are literally temporarily giving up your freedom. You're no longer a civilian, and you're no longer entitled to civilian rights for like 2 years at a time, however long a tour lasts. What this means is that when you're deployed somewhere, or even during training, you can't say, oh no, I quit, because you're literally not a civilian at that time. You have to wait for that time to be up. That is the big difference. You're signing away your freedom. So it's not like any other job they take. What this means, that I think the freedom to consent bar, like how we judge how free someone is versus coercion, should be much, much higher than it would be for any other debate on this issue, on like these similar issues. So I think it falls on our side. No, thank you. Now moving on to the second extension about how there's less reporting of bad conditions in upside, right? And I think this is what the army looks like. You get like these volunteers on their side, who are mostly like enlisted and low-level officers, mainly because they have no degrees, fewer skills, and they want the money quickly because most of them have established and they've accepted are poor, meaning that they go in immediately without like any of the prior training to become an officer where you don't get paid. Whereas officers tend to be richer, people who go for the prestige, think like Princes Harry and William, right? What this means is, note that when OO says people listen to the army because they get political capital this way, it's the latter group of people they listen to. It's the rich officers, not the poor, like enlisted people. So OG says, when politician Tory kids also go to the army, people listen to them more. Sure, that's good. But I think it's much, much bigger than that. Because the problem is that OG never proved is that no reporting happens most of the time in the status quo. 3 main reasons. Firstly, poor people are used to having no political capital. They're used to seeing politicians ignore them, so they don't expect to be heard. So they're less likely to report bad conditions, more likely to just suck it up. Like, note that U.S. soldiers in Iraq, right, literally had their shoes melt in the hot weather, and their families have to send them new boots. I think when the richest army in the world has these problems, conditions are probably bad for everyone, right? Secondly, note that if they do report, they're likely seen as annoying by their rich commanding officers. Like, oh, it's that complaining kid again, right? So they're either discharged or passed over for promotions, or just their life, no thank you, is made a living hell. Or even if it doesn't happen, they're afraid of that happening, right? And because they care about their career and not because they've gone in for the long term, right, they're unlikely to do this. Versus on our side, being conscripted for a year, 2 years max, leaving and being able to speak out, being able to report, fixing it for future soldiers. Third reason, this is symmetric on both sides, but it shows that there are no alternatives, really. The media don't report that much on either side when there are bad conditions, because that way they're branded as terrorists, traitors, not terrorists. Politicians hate them, and people just love their army, especially in more patriotic countries, right? The impact of this is that on our side, this all changes, right? Because it's all our kids, not that go necessarily, that could buy out their conscription, as Hamza says, but it's all our kids that could go to the army, right? And that makes people care more. It becomes a voting issue as opposed to something that only concerns the poor. It's also more in public consciousness on our side as a result of that, right? Because all 20-year-olds think, I might go, even if there's more people. Oh, I'm out of time. Whatever. On our side, the army's a lot better. Back to propose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech, and now I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the third speaker of the opposition side, please.
I think government bench loses in this debate when they fail to be comparative on the whole, because I think all teams in this debate have agreed that consent is incredibly important when deciding to join the army. When you join the army, there is the potential that your life could be in a potentially life-threatening situation. There's a complete encroachment on your bodily autonomy and could actually get in the way of someone's right to life. This is a fundamental requirement for any human being, something that cannot and all be sacrificed under any circumstances. Therefore, consent is so important. Then, if you just compare this then to these two situations. In recruitment, I think whilst we might concede there is somewhat coercive, there is always still an element of choice. Why? Because not every poor person joins the army. There are still some elements of choice they can do so. On the comparison, however, lottery, when you do a lottery, you just literally have no element of choice. It is just completely randomized. Therefore, on the way up, if we have a choice between everyone having at least some fundamental basic level ability to consent, versus a few select people having absolutely no ability to consent and potentially losing a fundamental right to life and ability to self-actualize. I think on the way up, we would rather save a more fundamental basis. Therefore, I think on the comparative, even if the army is as coercive as they say and does limit some people's choices, there is still some element of choice in recruitment, where for lottery there is none. And that when you have no element of choice for a right that is just so fundamentally behind. But again, I just don't think also that recruitment is inherently a bad thing, because even if it's exploitative, even if it's exploiting people with limited opportunities, it's still providing them with opportunities. That's how they do so. That's how they entice them. They provide them with things like tuition fees, degrees, training programs. There are lots of concrete benefits that can still be beneficial to people joining the army. And also, secondly, as our opening will discuss, there is still, I don't understand, they still have no better alternative. Therefore, removing this option doesn't give them any other options. There's probably still no other way they can get a degree and get any other forms in order to do so. Therefore, I do not see why suddenly removing one option is necessarily a good thing for them to improve. In terms of also this thing about contracts and armies and how it's different because you're contracted. If you have a job contract for 2 years, that is also you tied to that company for 2 years, they can also still send you aboard. I see it's a very similar option to many other things, and therefore not necessarily a bad thing that should be taken away from them. Also, I would like to point out that I don't think army is always exploitative. The army in many countries, the US, is actually seen as a very prestigious thing. And for many posts, you actually need things like a college diploma or university degree to even apply in the first place. I think a lot of rich, privileged kids also join the army, maybe not so much in as high numbers, but they're still there. Therefore, I think it's been unfair characterization to prove them as solely people who are vulnerable with no other options, when I think actually they have a lot of positive impacts that can benefit both sides. But anyway, I think this is what ultimately leads to, though, and two extensions of how it leads to, first of all, better treatment of soldiers, and I just think a better army in general. Why? Because I think if you have a lottery system, it means you have an infinite supply of soldiers at your demand. They're more likely to be seen as people that are disposable and not a long-term investment. Secondly, you have when the people that join, are probably just likely to drop out after their 2-year conscription. They do not see a future in the army. They do not opt into it. On the other hand, when you have for recruitment, you have to sell your army. You have to entice people to join. You need people to want to join. And I think government might say, oh, their ads are really deceiving and manipulative. I'd say, first of all, they can't just lie outright about what they That's what they tell people. They have to offer them something in return. Also, secondly, even if they have a really good propaganda campaign, people talk about their experiences, and people know that friends and family in the army, especially if you're from a neighborhood that recruits a lot of people. Therefore, people can still talk about negative experience in the army and alter people's perception through things like social media and raise awareness if there is a problem. Therefore, I think this means that, and also I think the soldiers that enter are more likely to see a future in the army and be more serious about it in the long term. Therefore, I think this changes the way that the top officials approach the army and approach recruitment to begin with. I think, one, they just have to provide more concrete benefits in order to entice people, things like tuition fees, training people for skills, etc. I think at the point at which you have a lottery, they lose this incentive to invest in these long-term changes because they don't see these people as long-term investments, and they just don't need to because they have an endless supply of army of people. I think secondly, you probably get more investment in training, because now when you have people that you know are going to be in it for the long term, you see that as a long-term investment, which means that every pound you spend in their training, you know you're going to get some form of return in their skills that they will give back to the army. Also, I think when you have to retrain less people, when you have less dropouts, you need to retrain people, train less people. Therefore, you just have more money to spend in general. I think also thirdly, you're probably better incentive on the comparative to give these people support, things like counselling, things like more support services that still aren't great under the status quo, but probably better on our side of the house when you still need to incentivise people to join. Because I think even if you buy the OG, in OG's case, that they lack a lot of political capital, I think this worsens when there is now a lottery system in place, because now these people have no leverage over army officials. They can't refuse to join the army and have any form of collective action when they're literally just forced to do so, regardless whether they are poor, rich, or from any form of background. I think also you just get a better army in general. Why? Because of the types of people who you recruit. I usually like to frame this as bullies and army fanatics. However, I don't think this is necessarily true. Why? First of all, by their own metric, they say that people who are recruited are vulnerable and exploited. Therefore, they're not people actively seeking out the army to begin with. Therefore, can't be these army fanatics they like to build. I also just secondly think it's very rare to get these like defence hawks in the army that just want to basically pick up a fight. I think the vast majority of people that join the army voluntarily are just people that want to train, want to learn a new skill, and see a long-term future in the army. They're not people that are just big army fanatics and want to fight a lot of people, especially how little time the army actually spends in active combat. I think the impact of this are threefold. I think first of all, you have people who are just better able to deal with the emotional and physical burden of the army, where it's often very high stress and have potential dangers. At the point in which you opt in, you're just more likely to be psychologically prepared for it. I think secondly, you just have a better army when you have people that want to go the extra mile. They see a future in it. They want to join the army in general. I think that's something that they are more likely to do. I think also thirdly, you get armies that have more experience. I think this has a lot of reasons for good things. I think this has greater, you have greater camaraderie between the army, greater sentiments of pride and feelings, and more continuity. I think, if anything, this improves army culture. The problem with army culture isn't fanatics and bullies. I think it's a culture of toxic masculinity when you have a lot of young people trying to prove themselves who lack a lot of skills and confidence and probably at a similar level in competition with each other and don't take it seriously. And there's a lot of lack of consequences with their actions. I think this is a toxic masculinity that is symmetric on both sides that feeds into army culture. I think this changes when you have more senior members, because first of all, they have the relevant experience. They don't need to constantly prove themselves. They lack that kind of young lad mentality where they're constantly trying to like pick each other out and better themselves. They can provide mentors to the younger people. I think also they just enforce discipline more when you have a continuity of the same people, the same armies, when you get to know your recruitments better and you get to form relationships. I think therefore you are less likely to act out and disrespect the rules when you actually look up to the people who are your seniors, who have been there a long time yourself and actually formed meaningful relations with them, as opposed to you being forced to enter the army. No, you're only in it for a couple of years, just there to have a laugh and then drop out for years. I think that's what fuels the toxic masculinity culture on the flip side. So for all those reasons, proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Speaker for that speech, and I'd like to cross the floor to hear from the Government Whip Speaker. I'd like to thank the Speaker for that speech, and I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the Opposition Whip Speaker.
Am I audible? Perfect. One moment. All right, two important questions in this debate. First of all, individuals. Second of all, toxic army culture. First of all, then let's talk about individuals, right? I think there are a couple of things to note here. First of all, I think we want to talk about the underprivileged, right? Because we get told this idea up and down the bench that the underprivileged are forced into the army because they have absolutely no alternatives. This completely erodes all their consent, particularly important considering CG's analysis about why consent is so important in this particular instance. Okay, let's ask what the comparative is for these individuals. I think the comparative is that they still have no alternatives, right? Under either side of the house, they lack the alternatives to do other things. So whether you are coerced, so you end up just being like coerced into living in a low-income neighborhood without any other choice that you're able to make if we accept the OG framing. If you think under either side of the house, there's no choice. What's the difference then? The difference is that the army is legitimately better for people in a lot of circumstances, right? In that it can provide apprenticeships for mechanics and pilots. It can provide paid tuition for doctors. There exists more of a choice for these individuals in that the army still needs to and the army still needs to go and look at better than something, right? The army still has a minimum standard that they need to meet, and that people still have to opt into going into the army, so they need to see it as a net positive thing to do as opposed to a net negative thing to do. I think we engage in their choice in this way. I know this is really sexy and debating now to say that people have no choice, but in this case, people literally do have a choice, right? Under our side of the house, there is literally a choice to be made, and that people opt in or out of the army. If the army appears to be a downgrade or a net negative compared to even really low standards of living, then people simply aren't going to do it. Note that this thing about people literally having choice is why not every poor person is in the army, right? There's a reason why you don't end up with schools where literally everyone goes into the army, and that's because people still need to be convinced to make that decision in the first place. George then goes and talks a lot about how you have this really high barrier for consent because it's so dangerous to go into the army and you're literally risking your life. They literally do our work for us here, right? They tell us entirely why consent matters. I think that the CG case here is totally irrelevant because it hinges entirely on OG's analysis about who actually gets higher consent and under which side of the house you get anyone consenting. So I think CG is entirely dependent on OG and totally irrelevant here in that they literally do our work for us when they tell you about how important consent is. Note that they literally eradicate this consent for people, right? And that the consent to give away your life, sign away all of your civilian rights, everything that George talked about is literally eradicated for everyone who comes into the military, particularly given the mechanism given by OG, where there is no mechanism for conscientious objectors and literally no one can opt out at all. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about some of the other stuff they tell us about individuals, right? Because we get told that you're going to be able to better help social issues when you've got more money to do so because you're not spending money on advertising. This comes out from Harris's speech. A few things to note here. One, note that you're spending money to retrain far more people, and that because your people's contracts expire and they're more likely to leave the military if they were put in the first place if they're forced as opposed to choosing to do so, they're likely to leave. So you need to train more people, so that costs a lot more money. I think also note that a lot of what happens in terms of spending money on these conditions is required anyway because of word of mouth, right? Like when the US Army put out their infamous tweets being like, how has serving impacted you? And they just got bombarded with thousands of responses about everyone telling them it's shit. They then had to release a statement saying, we're sorry about this tweet. Here are all the things that we need to do. Because word of mouth actually matters. Improving conditions actually matters regardless, but they also have the money to do this when they're not constantly retraining a bunch of individual people. When we get told about the ability of wealthy people to lobby for improving conditions, realistically they're just going to improve conditions for themselves as opposed to for literally everyone, because that's probably easier for them to do that. Poor people still end up screwed. But on the comparative, when you need to appear as a net positive as opposed to a net negative compared to something, you still need to look good to poor people because they still have some choice that they're able to make under our side of the house. You still have an incentive to improve your conditions somewhat. If you can't opt in and you cannot opt out, even if as a conscientious objector, you have literally no incentives to improve things because you don't need to appeal to people whatsoever. Right? Okay, I'll take the POI from opening before I move on.
Yeah, so the delta in this debate is the care about how soldiers are cared for afterwards, which gets more investment if the flow of people leaving is greater and there is a high risk of high capital kids being drafted. Your case hinges on soldiers internally being treated worse. How do I ever win a war or get promoted as a general if I don't train my soldiers to the best extent?
I think we'll explain the thing about training in a minute when we talk about army culture. But first of all, in this issue about people leaving, I think when you have a far greater outflow of people leaving the army, that means that you have to spend more of those resources on those individuals in the first place, right? There is a greater demand for those resources, even if there's greater supply, then the greater demand probably outstrips that. But second of all, note that, again, even if it is wealthy individuals who are doing this, and they're likely to do things like invest in private therapists for themselves, you're likely to go and look at like solutions that help themselves without helping the overall army culture. Because even if you're able to lobby the army to give you great therapists overall, they're still never going to be as good for everyone as just going and hiring the best therapists that you can possibly find for you individually. And it's also going to be really way more expensive and way more difficult to do that and to get that overall systematic change as opposed to just helping yourself. Let's talk about army culture, because we get told about how you dilute the bully types who go to the army because of nationalism when you put just literally anyone in there through a lottery. A couple of problems with this. One, the problem is the tension in their case, right? And when they tell you it's really, really easy for the army to just go and target poor people through coercion, I think either it's so easy to target these poor individuals and the underprivileged that they dilute the bully types anyway, or this coercion is so ineffective that only the bully types actually join the army regardless, and in which case their coercion case falls. We don't think that both of these can stand simply because you gain the benefits of dilution if their coercion case is true. Let's look at the problem of the wider culture then. We tell you that we think that the problem with the wider culture is not necessarily a problem with people going into it. And we think that's because you were trained so heavily that you grow into this role in the army. You are spending all of your time on a military base, receiving military training. You become so embedded in that culture. And we think that it's not, the problem isn't nationalists going into the army. The problem is the army making people nationalists, right? Because you're pumped with that propaganda. You're pumped with that hero narrative. You're pumped full of all this propaganda that forces you into this belief system. But more so than that, we think that the problem that we think that's symmetrical. The problem that we can change is the problem with untrained and undisciplined individuals. The problem is with people who don't care about their future in the army, because if you know you're getting out in 2 years, you know that's going to be the end of your career, and you have absolutely no incentive to improve your situation because it is entirely temporary. So you don't need to do very well. You don't need to look very good because you can be out very soon. You don't need to care. This changes when you have discipline. It changes when you have people who are being exposed to more training, so all their sort of like wild, reckless instinct to do what's best for them, what they think is like cool or impressive, or whatever, is trained out of them. And second of all, when these people have to actually care about their future in the military, and therefore they have to care about their conduct. We think that because we get less turnover, because people are going in and staying in the army, which note that we're the only team to tell you about this, we probably improve that. There, we also tell you that you get better incentives better support for people when you need to give people incentives to join, and that no one's going to join the army if you have really shitty incentives. Again, we refer you to the US Army's infamous tweet that I spoke about before. I think for these reasons, very clearly CO win. Thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker for that speech and lead your fantastic debate. We're going to go away and judge. I think you leave this room and go back to announce hall. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Good job, everyone.
Thanks.
Well done, guys.